Right. We're going to go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Tom Levine, and I work as Cornerstone's Commission and Technical Specialist. Today, we're going to be covering how I personally do my job, Excel. Excel is probably the most prolific spreadsheeting software in the business world, and you probably use some variant of the program one way or another, no matter what you do. Be it Excel, just a standard single download, you use a version through Microsoft 365, or you might use Google Sheets or an open source version of this software like LibreOffice. My goal today is to provide you with some tips and best practices using Excel for any kind of data analysis, and a lot of what I'm covering today will extend to those programs that I just mentioned as well. It can be pretty useful learning some basic formulas, functions, and learning some best practice for spreadsheets, and I recommend you follow along by downloading the files that I've made available for you now. They should be available for download in the same sort of area that you normally submit your questions, and you can have them ready on a second screen if you've got one. So without further ado, let's get into some housekeeping. First, if you have a question, please feel free to type it into that question box. It should be around where it's displayed on your screen right now through this slide. I might answer it in the moment, I might not. It just depends if I think it's relevant for what I'm covering in the moment. If I don't cover it right when you submit it, don't worry, I will loop back around and cover it at the end of the presentation. Also, if you don't want to submit a question directly and have it covered in the webinar, please feel free to submit it direct to me. My phone number and my contact information is displayed on the screen there. And you can also follow us on social media and subscribe to our weekly Monday Minute newsletter for the latest Cornerstone carrier and industry updates. Also, if you're an ASP broker, you can enroll in our ASP services program. It's a program designed to help you make a plan for your business, your clients, and your family, no matter the situation. Among the services provided in ASP are our autopilot system, which is our client referral program, Parachute, which is succession planning, and Flight Plan, which is retirement assistance. You can become an ASP broker today at www.crnstone.com/agency-services-program. Finally, you can earn up to $7,000 with Cornerstone's cash incentive program. You can earn more when you sell more, and it's for all group and individual new business sales between January 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2023. You can earn points that'll bring you closer to a $7,000 cash prize. Register today to qualify at www.crnstone.com/cash-incentive-program. Now exclamation point. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. If you're downloading the sheets to follow along, you might want to open up the sample tracker. We're going to start with some standard manipulation of data, and then we're going to get into the sample data that I've provided as we get into some of our later topics. So if you want to go ahead and open up the sample tracker, we're going to go ahead and get started on doing some basic spreadsheet manipulation. As you can see, there's only one sheet. And before we get started, I just want to say all of these policy numbers, policy holder names, all of the information you're seeing on your screen has been completely randomly generated. None of it's real client data, none of it's discussing any actual rates for any cases, and we're not getting into any actual product discussion with any of this. It's just a standard disclaimer. Don't think any of this is real. But it is useful for illustrating how you can kind of lay out a spreadsheet and how you can work on things. This is also the base for the sample tracker we'll be covering in our next presentation. So you might want to keep it downloaded if you're interested in attending that one. The first thing I normally do when I get started is I familiarize myself with new software. So we're going to cover some of the header information before we actually manipulate this data. The first tab you're going to want to look at is your Home tab. This would be right up here in the ribbon, which is what this upper area is called. I'm just going to circle it real quick in pen so you know what area we're talking about. That's this area up here, which is called the ribbon. And then down here under that is a submenu, and you can navigate between these submenus by clicking on the ribbon as well. Let's go ahead and erase the drawings. Now, my personal favorite tab to cover is the Home tab because it's pretty much got everything you want to use if you're a new person to Excel. You can insert cells, delete cells, and format cells from this menu up here. And you can also change your spreadsheet styles and looks really quickly just by doing, clicks up here in the style section. There's also some conditional formatting options, which we might cover here in a minute, as well as some general settings up here for your number types and the way you're typing. That's important, and we will cover it here in a moment. You can also change your fonts, as well as highlighting cells and changing your font colors with these options right here under font. Then we have the Insert tab, and that's kind of where you want to go to just add stuff to your spreadsheet. If you're trying to insert a table to kind of display data a little better, you would go here. If you're trying to add a picture or add a logo to your spreadsheet, then you would also go here as well and go into the Pictures section. You can also add things like charts in directly from this section of your menu, as well as graphs and column graphs, line graphs. You can even slice up data to make it a little more visible. Including inserting hyperlinks if it's relevant to what you're doing, and adding text boxes, which is something that I actually do later on in this presentation. If you open up the sample data and go to helpful information, I have text boxes in there as well. Next, we have the Page Layout tab, and this can kind of do some similar things as the Home tab. You can change the theme of your spreadsheet, but what it has that the Home tab doesn't is things like your margins, your print orientation, and size sections. This kind of just sets up your page for printing, and it's really what the main point of this section of our spreadsheeting software is. After that, we have the Formulas tab, and we'll be covering this in a little more depth definitely later on in the presentation. But suffice to say, if you're looking to add a formula or a more advanced function into your Excel spreadsheets, this is the tab for you. It lets you run through your recently used functions, as well as inserting a blank function and doing things like auto sum with this setting here. If I wanted to sum up data, I could just click on a cell, hit auto sum, and it'll automatically highlight a range of cells that it's thinking of trying to sum up. I'm going to go ahead and delete that and move on to the Data tab. The Data tab is what you use to kind of generally manipulate data. You can do things like removing duplicates from this section very easily. If you have a list of long, names, policy numbers, and types of policies, you could use this tool to automatically remove those names from the lists. You can also validate data, which is something that we use here at Cornerstone to validate our spreadsheeting tools. And you can also use it to kind of forecast numbers, group and ungroup sections, things of that nature. We also have the Review tab. If you're working on a spreadsheet with a lot of other people, this is probably a tab you want to use. Not only is it how you can enable worksheet protection, but it also lets you comment on cells that you think might have an issue. There's also the View tab here, and there's a lot of different views that you can use in Excel. If you open up a worksheet and it seems to be separated out by a bunch of pages, you can go ahead and select this normal view here, and that'll bring your spreadsheet back to how it should be viewed, more or less, if you're trying to edit things. You also gain access to freeze panes, and I'm going to go ahead and actually freeze the top row of my spreadsheet, and you probably want to do this no matter what spreadsheet you're working in. What freeze top rows does is it lets you scroll through the rest of the spreadsheet and keep your number 1 row up here at the top. If I go ahead and unfreeze and then scroll down, as you can see, our headers are no longer following us as we scroll. So that's something I'm going to actually go ahead and enable and keep enabled. If you freeze additional panes, then you're going to actually freeze, increased sections of your worksheet. I'm going to go ahead and select cell H5 to kind of show off this feature. If you go to freeze panes and then freeze panes further, as I scroll down, you can see that it keeps our cells from 4 up frozen on our screen. That's because I selected cell H5, and it freezes cells above and to the left of the cell I had selected. If I scroll to the right now, as you can see, my monthly premium data is staying where it is. If I want to undo this, I just unfreeze panes. I'm going to go back and freeze the top row because I like having my headers on my spreadsheets. Then I have the Developer tab here. It's not one that you'll normally see in your source side of Excel. So I doubt that you actually have this enabled. I have it enabled because I do macro work. You might see it if your organization has macros enabled on spreadsheets, you might not. But this is how you would edit that. And then lastly, we have this help tab right up here. This help tab is actually pretty useful. And if you have questions about anything we covered today, other than reaching out to me, I'm always happy to help, of course. I'd recommend using it. If you click on the help section of your help tab of Excel, then it'll actually bring up Microsoft's standard help window. Now, they've changed it over the years. So if you're using a version of Excel earlier to say, probably 2018, you might not have access to this feature. But it's pretty useful. I'd recommend downloading the formulas and functions worksheet here under help. If you just click on that, it'll lead you to a Microsoft Office link, and it should walk you through some of the standard helpful options. It's pretty useful, and I'd recommend going through it if you still have questions about how any of these formulas work at the end of our webinar. Before I get into some more data manipulation, I do have a question here, which is I don't see the downloads. Where are they? They should be in your audience view kind of circle under a section called attachments or for you or handouts, actually, I believe is what it's called. Yeah, it's definitely under handouts. If you click the drop down under your handouts section, it's kind of where you submit your question, Chris, then you should be able to see the attachments that are ready for download. Is anyone else having any other issues trying to find this? I'm not seeing any other issues, so I'm going to keep going on. But yes, Chris, I will email you these attachments after the presentations. Okay, so without getting into much more of the menu, let's go ahead and cover some general best practice when you're filling out a spreadsheet like this. And the first thing that I would recommend doing is actually removing merged cells. Now, carriers do this for a lot of reasons. One, it makes data more presentable. And two, it can actually make your work look a little more professional depending on what you're trying to display. Some people also like to merge a bunch of cells together in order to actually display like long paragraphs. Personally, I don't think that's the best option, but it's something a lot of carriers like to do. The problem with this is that it can interfere with entering formulas and it can interfere with some basic operations of Excel if you merge too many cells together. So the first thing I do when I'm working on a spreadsheet is I unmerge cells. Well, actually, that's the second thing I do. The first thing I do, and I'd recommend you do this as well, is I highlight the full range of cells. I do that by clicking in the upper left-hand corner of your spreadsheet, and then hitting Control Copy. Then I add in a new worksheet and paste my cells. The way I did that is I just selected cell A1 and hit Control V. After on spreadsheet 1, I highlighted my range of cells, hit Control Copy. So once again, that's just the upper corner. Control Copy. Spreadsheet 2, select cell A1, Control V. Now, if you're doing what I just did and you're just copying data over again, then it'll prompt you that there's already data here. And that's a standard feature of Excel. It's something that you can use to tell whether or not there's data already within the range that you're trying to copy over. So it's pretty useful in making sure that you don't accidentally delete information that you're trying to save. I recommend doing this no matter what type of spreadsheet you're working on. And that's because if something messes up, like let's say I accidentally deleted column 9 or row 9, my apologies. And I thought, oh no, I'd have no way of getting that data back. I can't, undo it. Something else went wrong. Then I can go back to this sheet 1 and just copy the data over again and start from scratch. So it's pretty useful to keep that base set of data separate somewhere else. I'm going to double click and rename this working. That way we don't accidentally overwrite our data in the first place moving forward. Then I'm going to select all of the other cells and I'm going to unmerge cells. Now I can already tell because of the way that these two columns highlight when I select any cell in row A or column A, that Columns A and B, all of these cells are merged. And I can tell that because when I click on one of them, columns A and B get darker, along with row 5, which is the row that I clicked, 4 or 3, etc. The problem with doing work in merged cells is Excel tends to not really like it. If I were trying to split up these names by the column, then it would take these names and put them over into column C, which is not really what I'd want. It gets a little messy, especially when you're trying to reference that text. So I go ahead and hit this merge and center button again after I select all cells. And that automatically unmerges all cells throughout the spreadsheet. Like I said, a lot of carriers do this because they think it makes things look a little nicer, but I kind of think it's an extra step. And the reason that I think it's an extra step that most people shouldn't do is because not only does it interfere with formulas, but you can resize cells incredibly easily. I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of column A after I go ahead and delete column B. And I do that by just right-clicking on this B section and hitting delete. If I extend out column A now by clicking on the border between columns A and B and just pushing it out to the right, then as you can see, I can see all of the length of these names anyway. I didn't need to merge A into B at all. It just has all of the information now listed in column A. If I tried to reference this data, I could get away with just referencing one cell. It'd be fine. I do have a question that I think is actually relevant right now. Mark, when I did copy the entire workbook, I followed by hitting Control E. Not sure how you down Control copy. Okay. I think I get what you're saying. So I actually didn't use any of the control settings to like highlight the full range of cells. All I did was click on this upper corner here. The reason I do that is because that's kind of Excel's cheat sheet way of just highlighting all of the data on your spreadsheet. If there were, say, here at the bottom of the spreadsheet, I'll scroll down. If I had data like right here under the spreadsheet, then by hitting this column right here, I select everything. The other way to kind of select data in Excel using your keyboard, like let's say I had cell A1 selected, is I would hit Control down or Control Shift down or Control Shift up and over, and that'll highlight like specific ranges of cells. I personally don't like that because there's data that I could miss that might not be included in the spreadsheet, but I recommend just clicking up here in the corner. That's what I would recommend doing to highlight everything. Then for copy, I do Control C. C is for copy, and then to paste, it's Control V, which is paste. Make sure you have cell A1 selected when you move your data over. The other thing you could do is just right-click and copy the tab itself. You can hit Move or Copy right here, and then you can hit Create a Copy and hit OK. And that'll create a copy of your sheet as well. So just another way to do kind of the same thing. Anyway, once you have your worksheet unmerged, the next thing that I tend to like to do is to resize all of the cells so I make sure I'm seeing all of my data. I do that by, again, clicking the upper right-hand corner, and then I actually just double-click between cells. And you might have seen some automatic adjusting, but I'm going to make it pretty clear. I'm just going to spread everything out a little bit. As you can see, because I had every single cell selected and merged or drug the one cell out of it, it automatically sized all the cells exactly the same that I had selected. Now, now that I have everything selected again, I'm going to double click in between columns A and B. And because I had every single column selected, it automatically sized all of my cells to sort of smush right up next to the longest set of text within that column. I can do the same thing to rows with the exact same command. I can just double click here and it automatically sizes my rows the exact same way. When you're doing that, you do want to click on the area in between columns. And that's just because that's the quick way of telling Excel how you want to set column to where the end of your text is. There are other ways to resize these columns and rows. You can right-click on it and go to Format Cells. And you can actually format a lot of things here for your row as well. If you go into Alignment and change this text setting here, I'm going to change it by 15 degrees. Hit OK. It actually slants your text as well. That's pretty useful for presentation if you're trying to print your spreadsheets. I'm going to hit Control-Z and go back into Format Cells. You can also change the way your text is aligned, left, right, center from this menu as well. You can also change the borders on your cells from this section, as well as filling them all with color and protecting your cells, all from this menu. All I did to access that was I highlighted the column, right-clicked, and went to Format Cells. As far as sizing is concerned, I could also change it from that setting right below Format Cells. I could hit Column Width, and currently my column width is set to 23.14. Let's go ahead and change this to 50. That'll basically double the size, and that'll make it pretty visible what that change is. And that automatically changed the column that I had selected, A, to size 50. If I wanted to do it to multiple, and I'm going to do the same sort of thing here to these rows, I'd highlight the range that I'm trying to change, right-click, and go to Row Height. And my row height is currently 15. Let's go ahead and change that to 30. I hit OK, and all of my highlighted rows are now all size 30, which can be pretty useful. I'm going to go ahead and double-click this here to resize those back to standard. But that's something that I like to do if, let's say, I double-click on one of these columns or one of these rows, and I get everything sized right, but column A is, let's say, all the way out here. There's some text at the bottom maybe that is way longer than all of these names that are listed. I can right-click it, go to column width, and just change it back pretty quick to something like 23. So that's a really quick way of resizing your columns. The next thing I recommend doing after you've unwrapped all your text and done all of that is go ahead and apply any filters for any data that you're trying to work with. The way you do that is actually from the Home tab. I just go into Sort and Filter, and then you can hit Filter to get all of these little drop downs up here. Now, what these drop downs do is they show you all of the data that's displayed within that table that you're trying to filter through. For instance, if I click on the carrier drop down right here, I have access to Aetna, Allstate, Anthem, Humana, Molina, and UHC cases. And I can tell that because that's what the data is all labeled. Now, one other thing here, I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Let's delete the carrier name next to Nick Horton. Now, if I click on the drop down, I also have blank cells here as well. So if there's a blank anywhere in your data, don't worry, it'll tell you if you look at the drop down. I'm going to go ahead and actually view all Aetna cases. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to unhit Select All and then hit Aetna as well as blanks because I removed that blank cell from Horton. And I'm going to retype Aetna in here and double check my filter. As you can see, now the blank cell is gone because I filled it in and it's only displaying Aetna cases. Now, if I scroll down to the bottom of this spreadsheet, you can see my scroll wheel got a lot shorter. It looks like I only have all of this amount of cells of Aetna. Now, the reason I say this amount is because if I look at these blue numbers here, see how it ends at 166? That doesn't actually mean that there's 166 policies for Aetna in this filter. Let's go ahead and apply a filter to a different carrier. I'm going to choose Humana this time. By changing the filter to Humana, as you can see, now my numbers start at 518. If I scroll to the bottom here, this ends at 677. There are clearly not 677 Humana cases. But in order to get a quick count of just how many Humana cases I might have, I'm going to click on the very bottom cell. This would be B677 in your spreadsheet for the Humana filter. Hold down the Control and Shift keys and then hit the up arrow on my D-pad. That would be the up, down, left, right arrows on your keyboard. Then I'm going to make sure I don't have the header selected, and I'm going to go right down here. I'm going to go ahead and circle it for you into the bottom section of my spreadsheet. As you can see, the count right there listed says 160. And what that count means is it's actually counting how many cells there are in the area I have highlighted. So now I know there's 160 Humana cases in the spreadsheet that I'm working with. There are other ways to do this, and we'll get into them a bit later. But that's just a quick and easy way to kind of sum up all of the cells that you're trying to count. Let's go ahead and do that to monthly premium here as well, just so you can see some of the difference of how that looks if you're highlighting a text column versus highlighting a column with numbers. As you can see, the data down here has changed a bit. My count still says 160, and that's because it's counting every single cell. But it also gives me an average of the cells I have selected down here as well. And it also sums up all of the information in that row. So if I were to sum up all of this column with this filter applied, I would know that there's $22,386 worth of monthly premium listed there. There are a few other things you can do to kind of highlight changes in this data. We're going to go ahead and undo the filter that we have selected here, just to make this a little more relevant. But the other thing that I like to do in spreadsheets is conditional format. Now, conditional formatting can be a little more advanced and a little trickier. And we're getting into some of the fuzzier topics, I'd say, of Excel. I say fuzzier because this is kind of the section where people stop having an intuitive understanding of what's going on. So I'd recommend you follow along here very closely. Let's say I wanted to find any monthly premium that was over a certain amount. Let's say $500, for example. But I don't want to apply a filter and I don't want to remove other data because I want to see just how those look in relation to everything else. So like I just want to be able to easily pull them out of my spreadsheet by visuals. I can do that with conditional formatting. I go to conditional formatting, and then I'm going to hit new rule, which is right here. That opens up the conditional formatting menu. And conditional formatting has a lot of different rules that can be applied. This one's actually pretty simple though. We're going to go ahead and go to format all cells based on their values, or what I think would be more useful for this is format only cells that are, which one here? Yeah, format all cells based on their values actually is probably going to be the easiest. Now I'm going to click on the drop down here. You can actually change it to use a different type of color scale if you want. 3-color scale works pretty easily. Maybe a data bar icon. I'm going to actually go ahead and check a few other options here as well. Here we go. This is the one I'm actually going to use. So real quick, let's walk through all these different types of rules. Format all cells based on their values is something that you can use to kind of highlight ranges of data. Let's say I wanted to see all cells between 500 and 1000, and I wanted those to kind of highlight based on their extremes of that range. I would go ahead and click format all cells based on their values, type the lowest value in right here, the highest value in right here, and then I would select colors for those cells as well. Now, if you're following along, you won't be able to actually select this. And the main reason for that is probably because of the data that we have selected. Because I have an entire column selected, it's not going to let me actually use this rule to the best of its ability. That's why I'm recommending for this section, we're going to hit format only cells that contain, and we're going to format it this way to set cell values between a certain range. We'll get back to this because that's the one I'm going to use in my example. But you can also use rules like this to highlight top ranked values. Things like the top 10 values of numbers. If I use this formula, it'll format those. Just click on the format setting here and I tell it how I want the top 10 valued cells to be formatted. I can click on format only values that are above or below average here to tell it to highlight values that are above or below the average within that column that I have selected. I just click on this drop down here and I can choose from one of these options. Above or below average is what most people will probably want to do. You can also do equal or above average, equal or below average, as well as standard deviations if you're getting into that kind of data analysis. You can also format duplicate values within cells. This is really useful if you're trying to pull out things like duplicate cell names. If we're using the policyholder name column here, we could use this to pull out anything that had the exact same name, just by visuals. We can also type our own formula here, but I'd recommend against doing that. Even I have trouble sometimes with using these custom formulas because they're not actually they use a similar syntax to the rest of Excel coding, but they're just a little tricky and a little hard to use. So I'd recommend against doing anything like that until you have a better grasp of how formatting works, especially conditional formatting. With that said, let's get back into formatting cells that only contain certain values. You can choose from this drop down here, formatting cells with specific values, specific text, specific dates occurring, blanks or no blanks, errors or no errors. We're going to go ahead and use cell value, and we're going to set it to any value greater than 500. I'm just typing 500 there. And then I get to choose how I want this column to format cells above 500. And I do that by clicking on Format. I'm going to go ahead and go to the Fill section because I wanted to highlight these cells. And I like to highlight things in orange. I just have a problem with yellow. It kind of sticks out a bit much to me, but feel free to select any color you want for this section. And I did that by going to the Fill tab. And I'm going to hit OK. Once you have your formatting selected, hit OK again. And it'll actually highlight all of the cells that are above 500 and cells that are blank. Now, the reason that it does this is because of the way that Excel does math. It interprets a blank cell as null, and null actually spits out error, and that error number is greater than pretty much any other number that you're going to have selected. The way that I get around this is I go back into conditional formatting and add one last rule. I'm going to add a new rule. Format only cells that contain. And I'm going to choose blanks this time. Then I'm going to go to Format, Fill, and manually select no color. So what I did there, I'm going to do it one more time, is I go to only cells that contain, blanks, Format, go to the Fill tab, and hit no color. And I'm going to hit OK, and hit OK again. And now I have only cells that are above 500 in value that are not blank. Now, the reason that monthly premium is highlighted as well is kind of a similar issue. It's interpreting the text that's in that box as a value. So it's taking monthly premium, converting that into numbers, and that tells me that the monthly premium value cell is above 500. So it can be a little bit finicky. It's why I don't really like to mess around with conditional formatting like this, unless I have a specific range highlighted. But it's something that you can do to easily kind of pull out values visually. If I look at this now, I can see like 2000's highlighted, 2765 is highlighted, but my column or my cell that says like 48 or 150 or 132 is not, which is why I think this can be somewhat useful if you're trying to just look through data and pick out a set of values or specific set of cells. From there, we're going to cover the last little bit of filtering that I think is actually pretty useful that a lot of people don't know about in Excel. Is if I go to my filter now, I can actually go to this drop down and filter by color. So if I go ahead and hit the color that we've just selected from our conditional formatting and hit that, now I filtered out only cells that are greater than 500 without having to type in that value. This is really useful if you're trying to only grab things like cells that are above an average or something like that in a spreadsheet. And we're going to definitely cover something like that here in our next webinar. So this is kind of setting you up for success for that one. Now that we've gone through some of these other options, I'm actually going to get into formulas. And for formulas, I'm going to go ahead and close out this spreadsheet and open up sample data. Now, I'm not going to save the changes to this spreadsheet because we're just kind of using it as a sample. And I want to have the base version of this spreadsheet available when I go ahead and actually run through my next webinar. But feel free to save if you'd like and fiddle around with the data in there. The way to get more used to using Excel is pretty much just by copying, pasting, using it every day, and getting into the flow of how you interact with spreadsheets. So I'd recommend just keeping the blank version just to fiddle around with one way or another. Now, sample data is the next spreadsheet we're going to be working on. It should also be available under handouts. But a tab that I want to point out before we get into this, and same as the other spreadsheet, all this data is fake. It's been completely generated. And in fact, the data from the spreadsheet we were just in was generated off of this table that I made. But go ahead and go to the helpful information tab before we get started and really messing around with the spreadsheet. Now, this is going to be your cheat sheet for the rest of formulas. It is what I personally use as a reference if I'm trying to type something out and I'm having problems. Not only does it list all of the syntax for formulas and have a little description of what that is over here if you get a little confused, but it also has logical operators listed, technical terms that you might have if you're Googling things or trying to figure out how to do something in Excel. These are basic definitions for things you might see referenced. It also has the basic operators of Excel listed right here. That'd be plus, minus, divided by, multiplied by, and equal sign and what it means. It also has descriptions for some of the best formulas that I think people can use within Excel. That tab is the helpful information tab right down here. The helpful information sheet, actually. I say tab because I wasn't excessively classically trained in Excel originally, but these are actually spreadsheets. It's the helpful information spreadsheet down here at the bottom. Now, today, to kind of highlight some of these syntax options and how to use these formulas, we're actually going to be covering these top three in the common helpful functions. That would be sum, SUMIF, and VLOOKUP. And some of the differences between these, because it can be a little bit difficult for new users to understand what the difference is. So if I look through these, the first thing I'm going to cover is syntax, and I'm going to do that by using the sum function. Now I'm going to go back to my sample data, which is the first tab here, and copy it to a new spreadsheet. Like I said, I like getting into the flow of copying things to new spreadsheets when I'm working on them. And we're going to name this working as well. The way I'm doing that is just by double clicking on the tab right down here at the bottom. And then I'm just typing over worksheet 1. Now that I have that, let's say I wanted to figure out the sum of this column. How would I do that? Well, there are a few different ways. All of them, however, use the sum function. I start by highlighting all of the data in column E except for row 1. I do that by clicking on cell E2 and hitting Control-Shift on my keyboard and then the down arrow. What that does is it highlights the entire range of those cells. Then I'm going to go into my Formulas tab and hit Auto Sum. Now it automatically jumps you to the top of that spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and scroll back to the bottom. You can just click and drag this bar over to the right. As you can see, I have a formula now at the very bottom of that column. That is the end of column E in cell 1001. Now this sum here is the sum of cells E2 to E1000. And I can tell that by looking in the formula bar, which is this section right down here. It's the section that's directly under the ribbon, and it has this little FX button right here that's insert function. That's another way that you can use these things. But what I want to focus on is this area right in here. That is the values of what I'm trying to sum. And the reason I want to focus on it is because it's a good example of what exactly this reference is trying to accomplish. Because it says E2 semicolon E1000, that's how I know that it's going to sum every cell within column E, because both of these are E, up to 1000. Now, I do see a comment here that I actually want to address, which is, should auto sum total update as you change numbers in a cell? I'm actually going to show you that. Yes, it does. So right now I have the number 12 right here in row E. The reason it's doing 12 is because this was calculated by doing 3 times 4, which is 3 subscribers at $4. Let's say I change this to 32 and take a note of what column E cell 1001 says right now. It's 11276. If I change this to say 50, now it says 11314. And if I hit Control Z to undo, it goes back to 12, and now I'm back to 11,276. So this is pretty useful, because if you're trying to figure out the total in a column or the total in a row, which is something else you could do, then you can just tell very easily what that total is, no matter what changes you make, by looking at the change in this value. Now, like I said, this section actually tells you what area it's summing. Because we had all of column E selected except for the very top row, it gave us a sum of cells E2 to E1000. But let's play around with this a little bit. Let's say instead of summing E2 to E1000, I wanted to sum, let's say, E990 to E1000, just the last 10 cells here. What I will do is I'll click in my function setting here, delete the 2 before the first part of the reference, and then change that to 990. As you can see, this blue section right up here also changed. And that's because instead of highlighting and summing the whole row, I'm actually summing 990 to 1000 within row E. If I enter then, as you can see, our number is now changed. We're actually only getting 76.4. And that's because instead of summing the whole row, we're just summing those cells. Now, the reason I wanted to point this out is a lot of times people insert functions or use some of these function settings and don't realize if something's missing or wrong. And that can completely throw off the data that you're trying to present. That's why it's very important to know what this section in here within the function means before you really start messing around with functions. There are tools in Excel that actually kind of automatically insert functions for you, like what we did to actually get this sum. But I think it's a lot better if, while starting using functions, you learn some of these basics that we're going to cover. Let's say that I wanted to take this function and I wanted to apply it to other columns and other cells as well. Let's say I wanted to take this function and sum the same range, but in column F. Well, there are a few ways to do this. I'm going to click on the cell, hit Control Copy, then click on the cell next to it and hit Control V. As you can see, now we're summing, well, cells in this row. If I click on the cell that I just copied this formula into, which is cell F1001, and look at the function here, I can tell that by copy pasting, it's now summing column F, row 990 to row 1000. Let's go ahead and change this a little further. Let's go ahead and copy this and put it in cell F1007. I'm just going to paste there. See how these values have changed? If I click on the function after selecting cell F1007, my range here has changed. It's actually moved with where I copy and pasted the formula. And this is where some other parts of syntax come in. Now, if you have the function section here selected and you click off of that cell, it'll actually change what's listed here. It'll think you're trying to change the range or something. So I'm going to backspace over that and hit enter before selecting a new cell. The way I got out of that, and I'm just going to demonstrate it one more time, is I accidentally clicked on like one of these other cells here. And if I look at the sum function, it's got more data here from F996 and F1006. It's K1002, which is the cell that I randomly clicked. If I hit backspace over that, then it just removes that reference. And then I hit enter to escape that formula selection. Now, like I said, there are a few other things you can do to move these values around. I went ahead and deleted the cells that I copied. And the reason I did that is because you can actually drag formulas around. I'm going to click on the bottom right-hand corner of cell E1000, and I'm just going to drag it over 2 and let go. From there, I want you to click on cell E1001 and just use your arrow keys to move over to the right and look at the change of what that did. It actually changed the letter, right? So that means that it's changing the row that it's summing. Now, the reason it did that is because I just clicked and dragged. If I click the same area of the cell and drag down instead, see how those sums are changing as well. I'm going to scroll down through these cells, and as you can see, each of those cell values dropped. Now, there are ways to make sure that when you drag and drop formulas like this, certain values don't change. And the way you do that is by adding in $signs. $signs are used to kind of lock in sections of references. So let's add a $sign to the front of this function, which is some $sign E990 semicolon E1000 now. And then let's do the same clicks and drags. So we're going to click on the bottom corner, drag it over 2, and click in the bottom corner and drag it down. And first we're going to scroll to the right after clicking on cell E1001 again. If I look to the right now, as you can see, the E didn't change in the first part of our cell reference. Why is that? Well, that's because we added that $sign up front. But the second part of that cell reference, F1000, did change. If I scroll over one more time, I can see the column we listed here in G is now summing E990 to G1000. And the reason it did that is because we put that $sign right in front of the E. Now looking back here at cell E1001, I'm going to start scrolling down. Now, those numbers did not lock in. They didn't change. Or that hasn't changed from how we dragged things around. And the reason that it did that is because we added that $sign up front to column E, but we didn't add a second $sign right here to 990. Now that I've added that, let's go ahead and do the same drags through this formula. And I'm going to look at cell E1000 again, go to the right, F and G still changed. But if I scroll down now, as you can see, it's still leaving cell E990 as our reference point because I also locked in the letter or the number here after E1000. Let's say if I drag this formula around, I don't want the value to change at all. I don't want it to sum a different range. I just want to make sure that if someone accidentally drags the formula, nothing changes. Well, then I add my $sign to the remaining 2 parts of this function. I'm going to drag to the right, and I'm going to drag down. And as you can see, all of these cells now just say 76.4. If I look through all of these cells, that reference did not change at all. So you might be wondering, why would I even want to do that? Why would I bother? Well, the reason that you'd bother is because let's say we're trying to add something new in here. Let's say we're trying to sum cells D and E of all of this row. Well, I can use a sum function. So let's go ahead and click this insert function option right up here. And we're going to use sum. Now, what I did is I hit the insert function and I just selected sum because it's in my recent functions. If you're looking for this, you can also type a function right up here, like sum, and hit go. And then it'll actually find the function that closely matches what you've typed in here. Then it asks you for the function arguments. These are the things that went in between those sections of cells right here. If I click D to E and hit OK, then I've got a sum of D and E. But let's say that I actually just want to see how this value changes over time. Well, I can click and drag this to the end. If I scroll up, we've got a sum of D to E2, D to E3, D to E4, so on and so forth. But let's say I mess up. Let's say I accidentally drag this to the right. If I look at this cell reference now, it's no longer summing D to E. It's actually just summing E to F. So if I wanted to change that really quickly and say instead of just summing D to E, I wanted D to G, other than just clicking and typing that change in the function box here, I could put a $sign on E or a D. I misspoke there. Drag to the right 2. Click on this function again, and now I'm summing 2 additional cells. Pretty easy to drag around. The other reason that knowing this kind of reference is useful is for the next function we're going to be covering, and that's VLOOKUP. Now, if I go back to my helpful information and look at the VLOOKUP and look at the description of this function, what does it say? It pulls data from an already created table into a new cell based on a reference value. This reference value matches to the far left column of your table array. Now, that's a little bit gobbledygook. It's hard to just understand just by reading it. So let's go ahead and actually do something with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the duplicate name count worksheet, and I'm going to look at all of these names. Now, this is neat that it has a name and it has a number of names next to it. But let's say I wanted to get the policy number for this name as well. Now I could do a lot of things. I could go to my working tab and I could try to find that name within the worksheet. But that's not always very useful because I'd have to do this for, if I scroll down, let's see how many names there are, 144 names. But I want to get a policy number for all of them. This is where a VLOOKUP is useful. I'm going to go ahead and insert a function. Let's go ahead and insert a VLOOKUP. Now, if you don't have this here, you can just type VLOOKUP right up here in your insert function section. I'm going to hit go and double click it. This gives me all of the inputs that the function has. I have a lookup value, a table array, which is what that description was referencing, a column index number, and a range lookup. Lookup value is going to be the value that you're trying to look up in the other spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and click on cell A2 because we're trying to find this name. Our next input, and I'm going to go back to the function arguments and hit the table array, is the range of values I'm trying to look through to find a policy number. Now, this is going to be in our working tab, and we're going to click policyholder name. Now, we actually have a problem here. If I drag it to the left, see how it says working B2 to C2? What that means is it's going to use this VLOOKUP to find a policy number match instead of a policyholder name match. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel and get out of this function. Now, if I run into a problem like this in my spreadsheet, I'm trying to do a VLOOKUP, but the column I'm trying to reference is not all the way to the left, I just click the column I'm trying to reference, hit cut, then I'm going to insert the cut cell to the left of what I'm trying to do. What that means is the VLOOKUP function is always going to look to the right of the reference column. So for example, this Buller Dolermo, I'm going to copy the name, go to working, and try to find it real quick, just to have a solid reference for you. Now that I found one of the names, now that our policy numbers are to the right, my VLOOKUP function will look through this list, find Buller Dolermo, look to the right based on our column index number, and find the policy number. That's the goal, at least. I'm going to close out of find and replace and go back to inserting our function that we were just doing. So I insert VLOOKUP, go, and find my VLOOKUP function. Hit OK. Select our name as reference, and then go to the table array. I'm going to highlight cell A2 over to C2 and all the way down. Now there are quicker ways to select that range. You can do Control-Shift and move over 2 on the arrow and then down. But I find that as you're getting used to entering these things, it's probably best to actually click and drag. It just makes things a little easier. Now if I look at the column index number, we're going to hit 3, or actually we're going to hit 2. And in range lookup, we're going to type false. Now, don't worry about what that means. It's trying to ask you if it wants to give you a near match or an exact match. We always want exact matches. So we're going to type in false here every single time, no matter what we're doing lookup. Column index number 2 means that within this range, which is A2 to C1000, we want the second column over from column A. What that does is it takes column A at 0. So column A is 0. Column B is then going to be 2, or 1, and then column C is going to be 2. So 0, 1, 2. Second column over from our initial column, which is A, is column C. So it's going to look through our values in column A. When it finds a match to the cell A2, then it'll spit out the value in column C that is right next to it. And I'm going to hit OK. Now, as you can see, this gave us the answer Aetna. And the reason that did it is because I actually kind of lied to you there. Now, I know we're kind of getting to the end of the presentation, and I'm going to make this part a little quick. But the reason that I did that is because we're actually trying to put in 3 here. If I enter 3, then it's going to give us 4879491. If I go to the working data and find that name, I'm going to just copy it to make it a little quicker. If I select our policy number here, 4879491, copy, paste it right here, you can see that number is the same. The reason that I talked about $signs before this is, let's say we wanted to do this VLOOKUP for all of these names. If I just click and drag this function, see how first it's referencing A2 to C1000? As I go down, this reference number changes as well. And it's something that this function inserter doesn't do. If I put a $sign, however, right next to A, and then extend that down, I just double clicked, but you could also just click and drag. We can see A doesn't change if I drag it now. And if I insert that next to 2 as well, and drag down, our value for the lookup in C is changing, but we're keeping A2 as our reference. And the reason that's important is we don't know what order these names are in. We also don't know if there's other values matching these names further down in the spreadsheet. So by making sure we lock in the first cell in our reference, we're making sure that we're always going to reference, at the very least, the starting range of data as we use a function like this. Now what VLOOKUP does is it just finds a match for whatever you're trying to match to and then spits out a number. The last formula that I wanted to cover is SUMIF. And it looks relatively similar to SUM, but it's a little bit different. What it does is it sums the values of cells based on certain criteria. I'm going to run through it a little bit. This is one of the more complex functions, and I actually don't recommend people use an insert sum here. It just makes things a little more complicated. The way you would type in a formula is you always start with equal, then the function name, and then parentheses. I'm going to do equals SUMIF, and then my parentheses. If you try to move out of the cell before you complete this function, it's going to give you this error, but that's okay. It also tells me the criteria for the function below here. It needs a range to match, a criteria to sum, and then a sum range. What that means is it's going to first ask me for a range of things I want to sum if I find a matching value. What's this asking for? Well, if I go to working, it's asking me to highlight all of row A. So I click A2, shift down, and make sure I add in my $signs, which is going to be after every letter and every number in this formula. When I'm ready to move on, I hit comma. The next thing it's going to ask me for is the criteria. How does it sum information? Well, I want it to count things. I'm going to remove the sheet name right here that popped up when I click next, or this next tab. I'm going to click on duplicate name count, A2. What's that telling me? It's telling me I want to look at whatever is in this duplicate name count sheet in cell A2. And that's my criteria. It'll now sum data if it finds in cell A2 to A1000 the name of Bueller-Guillermo. And I add another comma. The last thing it's asking for is a sum range, which is the range of cells that it's going to sum up if it finds a match. I'm going to highlight E2 to E1000 in our working sheet and add in my $signs. Then I'm going to hit enter, and that gives me a value. That's going to give me 393.5. Now, what does that mean? That means that after looking through every instance in column A of Bueller-Guillermo, it added all the values in column E that matched up to those lines. I'm going to go ahead and apply a filter here to kind of explain what that did. We're going to go to add a filter, UELER. I'm just terrible at typing today, I apologize. But I'm going to look at all of the Bueller-Guillermo names and hit OK. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of different policies here that have this name, not just that Aetna policy we looked at first. If I highlight column E now that I have this filter, and I look at the sum, I get 393.5. Our sum here was 393.5. So what that tells me is there's a total of $393.50 in our working file for anyone named Bueller-Guillermo. So that's what SUMIF does. It's actually really useful if you have a very long spreadsheet and you're trying to find however much premium you got from a specific policy number, because you can use this no matter where it is in your spreadsheet to find a sum. But like I said, SUMIF is a more advanced function sometimes for people. It's just important to know how to type in things into this function box before you reference it, but it's very useful. It is 10:35, so I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation here. But these sorts of functions are really something that we're going to use more in our next presentation. So I'd recommend reviewing all of the things here in this helpful information tab before we begin. Chris, like I said before, I am going to go back and email you these spreadsheets. And if anyone has any questions now, please go ahead and feel free. Again, sorry for going a little bit over, but upcoming for our Tech Tuesdays and some of our other webinars here as well. Let me go ahead and make sure you're looking at the right screen here. There we go. We do have a few good presentations coming up. Yes, this is all recorded and you're able to reference it as well on our website. I'll show you that here in a second. But upcoming, we have our individual corner webinar here on 3/15. That's tomorrow. Next week, we have a Build Your Brand webinar, which is how to get noticed online. And our next Tech Tuesday here on 3/28 is going to be how to actually use some of the things I showed you today to track information. That'd be things like the amount of commission that you're paid per month on a case. We're going to use that first sheet you downloaded to actually go through and track compensation, as well as figure out maybe if we're missing months in our sample data as well. So you definitely want to tune in for that. Afterwards, our next Tech Tuesday on 4/11 is going to be how to use AGV, which is also pretty useful. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and answer any questions now. I know this was a slightly longer presentation, and I'm sorry for that. It's just there's a lot of information to learn about Excel. Thanks again for attending, and I hope you had a great day.